Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Matt Helmer, the Managing Director of the Economic Opportunities Program. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's conversation, The Hidden Workforce, Prison Labor, Human Rights, and the Legacy of Slavery. This event's the first in a two-part series, Work Behind and Beyond Bars, Improving Job Quality During and After Incarceration, in which we examine the working conditions of people who are currently incarcerated and the challenges and opportunities they encounter in the labor market once they're released. And obviously, there's some overlap between those two things. We'll be covering a lot of ground that's connected in those two conversations. This conversation is a part of a larger series we call Opportunity in America that looks at the changing nature of economic opportunity that workers face in the US and how we can create an economy that works for all. Before we start, I just want to say a quick word to our friends, partners, and colleagues in Florida and other places affected by the recent hurricanes, that you're in our thoughts and on our minds, and we hope you're back on your feet soon. Just a quick word about the technology we're using today on Zoom. Everyone's muted. Please use that Q&A button to submit your questions. Use the chat box to submit your ideas and resources. If you want to post about this on the social media platform of your choice, our hashtag is TalkOpportunity. If you run into any technical issues, message us in the chat or email us at eop.program@aspeninstitute.org. This event is being recorded and we'll share it via email and put it on our website. And finally, closed captions are available. Just click that CC button at the bottom of your screen. So turning to today's discussion, we're here to tackle a pretty complex issue that touches on a range of issues from economic justice and racial equity to human rights and workers' rights and criminal justice reform. And although official job statistics don't count much of the work that goes on in our prisons and jails, I think it's important to recognize up front that the people behind those walls, they're not just inmates or prisoners, right? They're their daughters, their sons, their parents, their uncles, aunts, cousins, friends, siblings, and they're also workers. And our prisons and jails couldn't operate without their work, and their contributions make an impact in our economy too, in the billions of dollars, stretching into almost every industry and sector of our economy. Their work is meaningful in so many ways. Many work as part of our emergency response systems across the country. They fight fires, which means they risk their lives. And I would venture to say that on the ground in Florida and other states today, you can find people who are helping these states recover from these recent hurricanes that are currently incarcerated and playing a key role in helping that. We at the Economic Opportunities believe strongly that all jobs should be good jobs. That means work should offer economic security, opportunities for growth and economic mobility, and a safe and dignified workplace where workers have a say in the conditions of their labor and are able to shape their workplace. This is a standard we aspire to for all workers, no matter where they work, what job they do, where they live, or whether they're behind bars or not. But unfortunately, as we're going to explore today, those working behind bars often face conditions that fall short of these standards. The work is sometimes forced or coerced. It's poorly compensated, sometimes not compensated, and it comes with few, if any, protections. It's evident, I think, as well, that some of this forced, underpaid, and dangerous work violates some basic human rights. And at its worst, there's probably no other word to describe it than a modern form of slavery. But this is a complex and fragmented system that we're talking about. Conditions vary from state to state, from prison to prison, from jail to jail. There's differences between federal systems and local and state systems. And we know at the same time that work can bring meaning and purpose to those behind bars. And when it's done right, it can offer a path to that second chance that we aspire to give those who've made a mistake. And there's plenty of communities and correction systems that are working passionately and dedicated to making that happen. But nonetheless, today's prison labor practices and what goes on in our facilities raises some critical questions that we're going to tackle today. First of all, how did we get here? Second, how do we define the value of work and workers in our society? Third, what are some of the consequences and implications of exploiting incarcerated workers, many of whom are people of color? And fourth, how do we build a criminal justice system that provides quality jobs, opportunity, and dignity to those in its care at the same time we're trying to do that with our economy overall? We have a remarkable panel today to explore these questions. One of the most exciting panels I think I've ever had the pleasure of introducing. So let me do that real quick. I'm just going to put names to faces, but you can read all about them in their bios on our webpage. So we have Fred Redman, the Secretary Treasurer at the AFL-CIO, joining us. We have Andrea Armstrong, Dr. Norman C. Francis, Distinguished Professor of Law at Loyola University New Orleans College of Law, and the founder of incarcerationtransparency.org. We have Tony Cantillo, the Deputy Commissioner at the Maine Department of Corrections. And joining us by phone, we'll put up a headshot of him. We have Terrence Wynn, who's a prison reform advocate and founder and director of Priorities, Intentions, and Practical Exchanges. Terrence has testified before the U.S. Senate as well as the United Nations. And now it's my great pleasure to welcome Margie Mason, who's an investigative reporter at the Associated Press, to moderate today's discussion. Margie has been exceptional on this topic, and as well as so many others. Again, you can read her bio on our webpage, but she won a 2016 Pulitzer Prize for public service for a series of stories that she did about slavery in Southeast Asia. Margie, I can't think of a better person to moderate today's conversation, and I'm going to turn it over to you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Matt, and thanks to the Aspen Institute for hosting this event and bringing together these great panelists, some of whom I have worked with directly or indirectly during the course of my reporting on this topic. And that's kind of where I really want to start. Robin McDowell and I started looking at prison labor during the pandemic, actually. We wondered, why are incarcerated workers being tasked with making things like hand sanitizer and face masks, while the rest of America's workers are being told to stay home and protect themselves? And we came up with this question: are there two systems here, and why are there two systems? And this actually took us to a stakeout of a prison. That's kind of where we started. And that sounds crazy probably to most people listening to this, but for an investigative journalist, that was right up our alley. And so we went to the Louisiana State Penitentiary. And for those of you who don't know what that is, it's a sprawling 18,000 acre prison farm was a former plantation. And we waited for cattle that had been raised by prisoners on that farm to leave the gates. We followed that cattle to an auction house in Baton Rouge. From there, we followed a truck 600 miles to a slaughterhouse in Texas. And from there, we learned that the beef was going to companies that can, including McDonald's and Burger King and Walmart and Sam's Club and Costco. And so that was our first kind of surprise in all of this. Then we started filing all of these public records requests, and we were looking at agriculture because that very much links to the past. And we wanted to see what other prison farms, so in Arkansas and Texas, for instance, a lot of big prison farms there. And we found that they were selling grains, so corn, soy, wheat, to big multinational companies like Cargill, which is the largest privately owned company in the United States. Tyson Foods, that's another one. And from there, we kind of started looking at the supply chain, and we could see the spider web that was literally reaching from these prison farms into virtually every American's pantry or refrigerator through products that are iconic, like Coca-Cola and Meadow Gold flour and Ballpark hot dogs and Cheerios cereal. And then we also started looking at the leasing that's still going on, because we have work release programs where you have workers who are, and still incarcerated, but they're going out and they're in the community working. You might not know somebody serving you at McDonald's is actually incarcerated. And also a lot of correctional departments also have contracts that are direct with private companies. And so we were seeing people working at dangerous places like poultry plants. And then we started asking the question, well, what happens if they get hurt or killed on the job? And we found out that in most cases, they are not eligible for workers' comp or disability. It's extremely difficult for them to sue through the civil court. And even OSHA and occupational safety organizations or agencies at the state level often do not have jurisdiction to investigate. So in some cases, you might have an incarcerated worker standing side by side at a private company with a worker in the free world, but they have very different rights. and protections. And so I think, again, this goes back to this question of why are there two systems? And I think that's really kind of where I want to start this this conversation. And I'm going to turn to Professor Armstrong and ask you if maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself, but also can you kind of lay the groundwork for this discussion by talking about prison labor and its history and the connection to the 13th Amendment and how that provides a link between yesterday and today, touching on this issue of forced labor and those who are being made to work through hard labor.
Thank you so much for that question, Margie. And I'm also really grateful to the Aspen Institute for hosting this conversation. Decades ago, people were talking about this behind bars and advocates were talking about this, but it's a whole nother thing to see it in the Senate, to see it in mainstream conversations. And I'm just glad that we're paying attention because these are, in fact, our institutions. And so it matters what happens within them. So I am a law professor and a researcher. I look at conditions of confinement, what happens behind bars, specialize in a couple of different areas, namely forced labor. I also examine, document, and analyze mortality or deaths behind bars. And then I look at healthcare issues behind bars. So I'd love to start at the beginning because I think it's really critical to understand why these systems operate so differently as Margie just explained to us, right? So there's one system that applies to people who are in the custody of a sheriff or a warden of some sort. And there's a different set of rules that apply if you're free. And so the question is why? Well, one part for jumping into this conversation is understanding the 13th Amendment. So the 13th Amendment was passed after the end of the Civil War. It was adopted and ratified by the states. And it said forever that slavery and involuntary servitude were abolished. But within that 13th Amendment, there was also an exception clause. And it says, well, if you've been convicted of a crime, well, then we can still force you to work, right? So involuntary servitude is allowed in those limited cases. And what we found is after the Civil War, that states were attempting to maintain the same social and economic systems that they had employed before the Civil War, right? So the systems that maintained a population of people subservient and dependent on the white population because our slavery system was in fact race-based, right? And so after the Civil War, when slavery was abolished, we found that there were a number of laws that were passed in order to recreate the secondary status, primarily of African Americans at that point, but also of other racial minorities. We might think about Chinese Americans who were coming across predominantly on the West Coast. There's interesting research about Native American populations and the ways in which they also were considered to be enslaved in secondary status. So this 13th Amendment allows for the use of our criminal justice system to essentially recreate systems of forced labor. But that's all that it says. And so what we saw in that period immediately after the 13th Amendment is the adoption of things like the Code Noir here in Louisiana, or what y'all may know of as the Black Codes, which would take otherwise legal behavior and criminalize it. We saw the numbers of people who were incarcerated skyrocket, predominantly of racial minority populations. And we saw that population that was incarcerated increasingly deployed to do major infrastructure work, to be leased out to private owners, and to kind of, particularly in the South, operate these penal plantations, which were old plantations that were then purchased either by new owners or sometimes by the state, and then operated in very much the same way, using the same buildings, the same crops, the same tools. So that's just an entry point as to how our history connects us, because what we see in some of the states that Margie mentioned, in Louisiana and Arkansas and in Texas, for example, is that those same spaces are now used as prison farms, right? And so thinking about that continuity of history really matters in this context.
Thank you. Terrence, you spent more than 30 years at Angola, and you have a very clear idea about what forced hard labor really means to those people behind bars. Can you first tell us a little bit about yourself and then explain why it is so important for people on the outside to become aware of this system that has existed there for so long?
All right. Hello, and thank you for having me. I'm Terrence Wynn, as you said. I went to prison at 16. I was tried as an adult, and I was sentenced to a life sentence at hard labor, where I spent all of that time at Angola. And stepping into Angola at the time that I did, it was like taking a step back into history, where when you look at slavery movies and you see how it's portrayed, all that was going on, where you have the guards on horsebacks with the guns, big walls of tobacco in their mouth, and they're pushing these lines and making people keep working regardless of the conditions, regardless of if their bodies are suffering and can't keep up. You got to keep working. And so I lived through that. I lived through the cotton picking era in Angola. And I lived through the era where if you didn't work, you was going to get jumped on. You was going to get beat. And a lot of guys didn't want to work, but they was afraid of taking those beatings or afraid of going to solitary confinement for long periods of time, because there was a lot more things that was going to happen to you there. So some guys just suffered and just worked. And what's important to know about it?
Thank you. Secretary Treasurer Redmond, can you talk a little bit about how prison labor connects to the broader labor movement and the AFL-CIO's work? And also, I mean, the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that incarcerated workers...
The fact that then you became...
Oh.
So now it's about everybody gaining something off of you because you committed a crime. And people are made to think that you're not human because you committed a crime and you went to prison. So people should know that you breathe, or that you care, or that you hurt, or that you laugh, or whatever. People are trained not to see those that are incarcerated as the same human beings that we deal with every day of our life. And so it's made to be right what's going on with a prisoner. Is people have to see it as being a right, because they said that for your crime, this is what's supposed to happen to you, when in actuality, that's not really what's supposed to happen to you. You're doing time. But then you can't even you're working, but you can't get paid for your services in a country that says that you're supposed to get paid for your services. So the law becomes not clear, ambiguous. That's the word I want to say. It becomes really, really ambiguous, because on one hand, we could say, this is what the law says, and you got to follow it. If you don't follow it as a business owner, you're going to be penalized for it. But when it comes to this group of people, you can break that law. It doesn't matter. So we're dealing with a country that practices a double standard, even in its handling of its humans. Because for the same crime I went to prison with and had life in 25, there was a white woman that started a whole riot in our city. She only got 12 years. And the judge told her, the only thing you did wrong that day was bought drugs. Not that you killed a human being, but you bought drugs. So going into the prison system, people need to know that you still racism plays a part in even within the system, because every white person that I entered Angola with, none of those guys had to go into the field to work. Like when it was time for us to go in the field with you during our time, you would get at least 3 days without going into the fields. But when we had to report to the gate, none of the white guys had to go in the field. They were given jobs. They was given jobs out the gate. Where every black person that come into Angola, if you don't have a condition where you can't walk, or you have one arm or something, you're going in the field. And so it's a different treatment of people based upon their color when you walk through the gates of Angola. I can specifically speak about the time that I walked in Angola, which is June the 24th of 1991, up until I left prison, which was July the 1st, 2020. Black prisoners got treated differently than white prisoners. When white prisoners will walk in, they already have the advantage of being white. So things were going to be way more easier for them than it would be for a black person. And those are things that people in the society need to know. How the passed down system of slavery has never went anywhere. It still exists today. And all you have to do is to look into our prison systems, and you would see the exact replica of the systems that was in place before the Civil War ended in 1865.
Thank you, Terrence. Secretary Treasurer Redmond, I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how prison labor connects to the broader labor movement and the AFL-CIO's work. And also, the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that incarcerated workers cannot form unions, so they can't protest, they can't organize, even against poor working conditions. So given that, do you see two separate systems here, and who is profiting from this?
Well, thank you, Margie, and I too want to just thank the Aspen Institute for bringing light to this important subject. Just a little bit about me. I grew up in Chicago, Illinois. I'm a second-generation steel worker. I went to work in an aluminum mill where my father worked long time ago, back in 1973. My father was a union official. I got involved in a union, held various jobs in the local union. I was vice president for 2 terms. I became president of the local union where I served 2 terms. I was hired by the International Steelworkers Union, where I was hired as a servicing staff rep, and went on to hold other positions. I was the director of the Steelworkers Education Program, and I was the lead bargainer for different sectors of the Steelworkers Union, our healthcare sector, our container sector, shipbuilding. And then in 2006, I was elected vice president of the Steelworkers Union. And as vice president of the Steelworkers Union, I directed our work on civil and human rights. And then I was elected to the AFL-CIO Executive Council, the governing body of the AFL-CIO, in 2008 to represent the Steelworkers Union. And as a member of the AFL-CIO Executive Council, I was asked to chair some efforts by the AFL-CIO racial justice. In 2006, I chaired the AFL-CIO's Commission on Race, where we studied the issue of race within the labor movement, how its effect that it had on the labor movement. And then the most recent work that I've done with the AFL-CIO, specifically on race, was the chair. I was appointed by the former president, Richard Trumka, to lead the AFL-CIO's Racial Justice Task Force. And upon his sudden passing in 2010, 21, I was asked by his successor, President Liz Schuler, to be the Secretary Treasurer of the AFL-CIO, and we were both elected, myself and Liz Schuler, to our current term in 2022. So with that, let me just say, look, the labor movement has always fought for everybody's rights to have dignity on the job and access to decent and fair wages in exchange for their work. You know, we believe very strongly that all people have the right to share in the wealth that they create on the job, or they help to create on the job every day they go to work. And as far as the labor movement is concerned, forced labor is never acceptable. It's a violation of our fundamental human rights. We have a long record in the labor movement of speaking out against forced labor wherever it exists, whether it's abroad or here at home. And the American labor movement is committed to the advancement of civil and human rights, to the advancement of social and economic justice. We believe, as Dr. King believed, that an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So when civil rights groups and labor groups, including one of our affiliated unions, the AFL-CIO is a labor federation where we represent 60 national unions and a total of 12.5 million members. But when one of our affiliate unions, the Retail, Wholesale, and Department Store Union, RWDSU, along with Alabama's current and formerly incarcerated citizens, they filed a federal class action lawsuit last December. And we supported the plaintiffs in the lawsuit. And we are committed to fight back against forced labor, as I stated, wherever it goes. And another thing is this idea of prison labor, the system of prison labor cuts into some of our core jurisdictions that we have through collective bargaining, and when we look at the system in terms of prison labor, because of their experience, because of their access to workplaces, and I'm speaking on Alabama specifically, okay, which has, during our research, we found in terms of percentages, okay, they have the lowest parole rate in terms of prisoner release in this country. And a lot of those prisoners, because of their work history, can become qualified to join our apprenticeship programs, to rejoin our training programs. The labor movement, we are the largest employer trainers in the world. The only people who train more workers than us is the U.S. military. And, so we feel as though this system of prison labor is infringing these prisoners that are eligible for parole, but not being allowed to get parole, the opportunity based on their work experience to further that work and be meaningful and contributing members of society.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Tony, I want to turn to you, and I'm just wondering if you can tell us a bit about your background and your work at the Maine Department of Corrections, and how does prison labor fit into your state? What do you do to ensure the health and safety of incarcerated workers in Maine, and how do you protect them?
Sure, and good afternoon. So Tony Cantil, I'm the Deputy Commissioner for the Maine Department of Corrections, and in that role, I oversee essentially all the operations within the Maine Department of Corrections, to include our facility operations and our adult community corrections and juvenile divisions as well. In Maine, we are doing things a bit different. We feel it's our approach in corrections and looking at three real pillars of our model, and that is humanization, normalization, and destigmatization. And so one of the big things that we have really traveled down is the value of education and true meeting of needs to the best of our abilities. As we talk about work, work is one aspect, But one thing that we try to strive for is providing education and educational opportunities that lead to pathways for sustainability and increased resources for our residents as they transition back into the communities. That includes, being collaborative with our State Department of Labor in establishing apprenticeships so that there is those tangible workflows towards something in a career beyond incarceration. And not to get too ahead of the questions for the rest of the discussion, but also expanding on how technology can play a role in the expansion of work and career opportunities, much like it is for you and I right now as well. So as I leave with this introduction, our mission statement at the Maine Department of Corrections is to make our community safer by supportive intervention, empowering change, and restoring lives. And so as we look through that lens of our mission statement, we take a look at all aspects in which we could have a positive impact towards that. And as we go on with the topic of today's discussion, that of being work, I will go back to how education leads to that, and how those opportunities come from just that exposure that education can provide.
Thank you so much. Secretary Treasurer Redmond, I'm wondering if we can kind of, you touched on this just a minute ago, this suit. And I just want to, for people who are just hearing about this for the first time, I want to kind of spell it out a little bit.
Sure.
The AFL-CIO is part of this class action lawsuit against the state of Alabama to basically looking at the forced labor within its prison populations there. The suit says that the Alabama Department of Corrections denies Black prisoners parole at twice the rate of their white counterparts in order to maintain a cheap labor force through wrongful detention. So I'm wondering if maybe you can delve into this a little bit deeper and just tell us, the union involvement in this. I mean, I think the lawsuit itself is very novel in that, we're seeing this, although we are seeing a similar lawsuit in Louisiana as well. So these things are popping up. And again, as I mentioned, incarcerated workers are not eligible. They cannot unionize, they cannot organize, they cannot protest. And if they do, they will be thrown in solitary confinement. They could have their privileges stripped away from them, or they could even have time added to their sentences. So, I mean, can you just kind of go back to the suit and
Sure.
why it's so important, given what you've just described, your whole life's work is fighting for workers' rights, when you hear that in this country, and I didn't mention either, but one of the things that we found is that, we know that when labor from prisons is goods produced through labor from prisons overseas gets to our borders, it's illegal, and those ships are seized. Yet what we found is that goods produced by prison labor here in America, it's being shipped through supply chains all the time overseas. So there seems to be this double standard going back and forth on a lot of things here. And maybe you can touch on that a little bit.
Sure. And look, without no disparagement intended toward a lot of great people in the state of Alabama, the fact of the matter is Alabama became the birthplace of the civil rights movement, not by choice, but by necessity. It was where the currents of racism and segregation and discrimination ran the deepest. And Alabama's a place where the right to vote wasn't a right for all of us, and where the justice system was most unjust. And in the decades following the Civil War, Jim Crow laws, coupled with a loophole in the 13th Amendment sentenced young Black men to work on chain gangs. And their labor was a major source of revenue for Southern states through convict leasing, especially in Alabama. And by 1989, forced labor was the main engine of Alabama's economy, accounting for 70%. I'm going to repeat that. 70% of this state's budget. Now, today, the United States is one of 17 countries in the world that still have forced prison labor. And although several states have passed constitutional amendments in recent years to outlaw slavery as punishment for a crime, including Alabama, there have been reports of coerced labor of the incarcerated, reports that people who have paid their debt to society are being denied paroles, mainly Black Alabamians who were being denied parole in our study at a 2-to-1 rate compared with their white counterparts. Disproportionately denying young Black parole is partially why more Black people account for more than half of Alabama's prison population, though a little over a quarter of the state of Alabama's population happens to be Black. Alabama prisons are overcrowded, they're understaffed, and they are amongst the most violent and dangerous places in the world. Now, so denying parole to low-risk Black incarcerated people with a demonstrated history of safely participating in off-site work programs, it ensures that they will remain available to provide labor in a scheme that generates nearly $500 million in annual benefits to the state of Alabama. And this is why Governor Kay Ivey keeps people in prison. The state is profiting from this prison labor. And if these incarcerated people refuse to work, then they are at risk of being put into solitary confinement. So, because of our belief that we believe that work should be voluntary and the prisoner should be fairly paid and treated humanely, they should be trained properly, and their job should be safe, because the fact is that private employers, they tend to assign incarcerated workers to the more dangerous or less desirable tasks because they understand that incarcerated individuals are rarely in a position to say no. Incarcerated workers are limited in their ability to advocate for improved workplace conditions, to organize themselves and their co-workers, to publicize workplace abuses, as you mentioned, or to pursue or participate in wage and hour other workplace litigation. So this is what we want for all workers: the ability to raise standards, advance racial justice by allowing workers to freely organize unions and advocate for their rights in the workplace. Now, despite these obstacles, okay, these prisoners in the Alabama prison system as underground collectively organized amongst themselves, okay, to take on this fight. So the labor movement, after looking at the case, after doing some research, after looking at the other plaintiffs in the lawsuit, we decided to be partners with these prisoners and to fight this injustice.
Thank you. Andrea, a common stereotype of prison labor is people making license plates, and they are indeed still doing that in many states, as we know. But I'm wondering if you can talk about some of the jobs most Americans would never guess incarcerated workers are doing. And can you touch on how private companies who are short-staffed or desperate for workers are turning more and more to prisons for the answer, including industries that are dangerous, places like meat processing plants, for example? And how can that lead to problems if these incarcerated workers are hurt or killed, given that they are not legally considered employees?
Yeah, so I think it might be helpful to bring together a couple of threads here, right? And so when I think about prison labor, I think about four distinct elements of it. And I think it's been mentioned by a couple of different people in different ways. The first is that it's involuntary, right? So unlike you and me, like if I don't do a good job, in my workplace, my boss can't deprive me of access to my family, deprive me of access to the outdoors, cut off my phone, cut off my pay, like cannot punish me in the same way, right? Radically different. The second feature is that it's unpaid or not fairly paid. And so some of the work that Terrence was talking about, that's 2 cents an hour, right? So there's a man who worked for 15 years in a Louisiana prison, and when he came home, he could buy his mom a bouquet of flowers. That's how he had $131, right? And so it's just not paid in a fair way. There's a small slice of these programs that are. The third feature that I think is really important that we've talked about is that it's unprotected by the legal status. And this is where it gets to the question you had, Margie, about whether or not somebody's considered an employee. So you might go, well, wait a minute. Shouldn't somebody get the minimum wage? Because don't we have the Fair Labor Standards Act? We do have that, but courts, not legislatures, not you and I, not the people we have voted for necessarily, courts have decided that incarcerated people, by and large, not in all cases, are not employees because the purposes of their work, the people that they work for, tend to be different. So, what that means is so many of our labor laws that protect employees don't protect incarcerated workers, right? And that's just a matter of interpretation. The fourth feature, and I'm sorry, continuing with unprotected, they also can't organize, there's no workplace protections, there's no whistleblower protections. So there's a whole range of things that the law just says, no, it's not our concern. Workman's comp is another example, and you had mentioned that earlier, Margie. The fourth is that it's just not related to reentry or rehabilitation, right? And so this is what people talk to me about, where they literally are just picking grass out between slabs of concrete, right? Where the work just seems like a more of a punishment than something that is part of a reentry plan or workforce development. So with those 4 points in mind, to understand the differences between the two systems, we can then think about what are the types of jobs that people are doing, right? And so much of this labor is about, in fact, maintaining the institution. This is kitchen, this is laundry, this is medical orderlies providing care for our aging and graying prison population. This is, they do a lot of the administrative and clerical work that's required to run these institutions. And so in so many ways, they are taking jobs that could in fact be performed by other people, free people in the community, who then would have an opportunity to demonstrate the ways in which the free world labor economy works. So there's maintaining the institution. They may work for a private corporation, both behind the wire or outside of the wire. So behind the wire, there's a number of companies that have established kind of mini plants. You think about like e-recycling centers, for instance, are one example. And then there are those that, like Tyson, operate meat processing plants on the outside in which incarcerated workers also work. And it's not just private corporations. Baltimore County, for instance, uses incarcerated workers in its recycling plant who work alongside free workers, and yet are treated very differently because of their incarcerated status. So a lot of this work is not just prison-based either. It includes people who are in immigration detention increasingly, particularly those that are privately run. And courts have upheld that as a form of fiscal contribution or as housekeeping duties and responsibilities. But they too can be punished with solitary if they don't complete the job as ordered. Jails, people who are held pretrial are also being forced to work. And then people who are being convicted are also forced to work in a variety of different jobs. Sometimes that job happens in really dangerous situations. And so I mentioned that I work on mortality. I look at deaths. We have workplace related deaths. For instance, we have deaths of people who were working on boats in the Mississippi River, work that they may not have been trained for, who then drowned as a consequence of being assigned to that job. We have someone who was assigned to check water meters and was riding in the back of a pickup truck. The truck turned, hit a bump, they fell out the back and had a traumatic brain injury and died as a result of that job. What I think is probably one of the more egregious examples is, Matt started this conversation about how incarcerated workers have helped in disaster cleanup and work. And I think when I talk to incarcerated people, their ability to help someone in need, to help communities in need, is a point of pride. And it's something that they're proud to have done. But because of their incarcerated status, they can be asked to do dangerous things upon pain of punishment that they could not ask a free worker to do. And then when it comes afterwards to sue for damages, to get the type of relief that's needed, there's so many barriers to their care. So I want you to think about the BP oil spill, for instance. Cleaning up that oil from the animals from the beaches was an incredibly toxic experiment. We know and have documented significant lifelong health injuries for people who were involved in that cleanup effort, right? At the same time, incarcerated workers were sent out there with no safety gear. When it came time for the class actions to address that care, they also were not included in those settlement options. They were essentially a forgotten worker force that wasn't included. And so we need to think critically about when incarcerated labor is appropriate, what choice people have in engaging in that work, and to ensure that they are not put in a position that is more dangerous than a free worker who was trained to do that particular task. I hope that was helpful in understanding the range and the breadth and depth of forced labor, because it is literally, as you let us off with, Margie, it is everywhere in the US economy, political, and social system.
Definitely a lot more than license plates, right? Terrence, I'm just wondering if maybe if you could kind of paint a picture for us about what it was like to wake up and work in the fields at Angola, to have men with guns on horseback watching over you in the searing sun, all on a former slave plantation. And what happened when you were asked to pick cotton? And what happened if you refused to do it?
Okay. You have to think of it from the stance of this. A kid, never had a job, coming out of a city. You're going into a place where it's nothing but farmland, something you're not accustomed to doing. And you're told you got to go to the gate. And you go to the gate, and there's just men everywhere. So wait to go out the gate. You get your name called walking through the gates. And then you're going to stand up next to a guy. And this guy's in front of you and this guy's behind you. So when everybody comes out, the field foreman and the security man that's inside, they're going to walk down and get an accurate count on how many people came through the gates. Then the man on the inside going to go back through the gates and he's going to lock you outside. So now you locked out of your living areas. So you're going to walk to where you got to get your tools. But when I went, you didn't have to get a tool because it was during this cotton time. And so when the cotton time comes, I refused to do it. And they was really beating you during that time. If you was refusing to go to work, it was going to be a truck. It was going to be a lot of trucks coming. And they was going to handcuff you, and they was going to rough you up, and they was going to throw you on the back of that truck. Whatever happened to you when you land on the back of that truck, that's what happened to you. and they was gonna bring you in. You was gonna go to the dungeon, which is administrative segregation. But if you just stay in the field, so I'm gonna take you to a different area where you're using tools, so you can see this picture. Come out, you go get a tool, which is probably a whole or this slang blade. But one day we got this slang blade, and we cutting grass that's way over our heads. Two guys that got into it. Don't nobody. I mean, some guys know what's going on, some guys don't. So one of the guys hit the other guy in the neck with the disc playing blade, and his head literally came off. And everybody that was in the line saw this. His head came off, and he died. And you saw it's other incidents where you would see guys using the tool to hurt one another because they've gotten into it. I can recall us working all day, and it was like 100 and some degrees. It's extremely hot, and before we come back in, you'll get some water because we was using blades this day too. And so a guy walked up and say, man, don't line up where you was lining up at, because I'm finna do something. And so I didn't line up where I normally line up at. So we walking in and the line turning, and the guy runs out the line and hit the guy in the head with the displaying blade, and almost knocked his ear out, but he put a big old gash in his face from his hairline all the way down to his neck. And it almost knocked his ear out. But then, aside from the violence, he's working in this extreme heat from like 7, when you're going out the gate at 7, you'll make it to your work site probably about 7:30, 7:45, and you're working nonstop, either cutting grass, high grass down, and at this time you have to make it to where you don't see nothing but dirt. If you have little specks of grass in it, you was gonna get a write-up. When you're working 7 to 11, then you come back, you go eat, and at 12 you're coming back out. You're working from 12 to 4, and you're working hard to where your clothes is literally dripping water, which is your sweat, and then you dirty because dirt flying in your face, and then you trying to fight to learn law to get yourself out of there, but you so tired that the only thing you can do is come in, pull your locker boxes out, or just get on the floor and just go to sleep. And if don't nobody wake you up to go eat and you ain't got no money, you're gonna miss going to eat because you so tired that you can't get up. And then you're in the dormitory at this time where it was like 68 men, and everybody trying to get in the shower because they want to get out those wet clothes, and they want to get in their bed so they can get some rest. So they got to repeat that process. And then if you was getting write-ups, you was working to get your weekends off. You wasn't working for the 2 cents that Professor Armstrong talked about. You was working to get those weekends off because you don't see those 2 cents. It takes so long for that to build up for you to buy something. But if you got a write-up, you don't much get those 2 days off. So you would have to work every day, even on the days that you was hoping to get off. And you just doing this. You're doing sometimes strenuous work, sometimes tedious work. It becomes tedious when it's cold and you want to do the hard work, but it ain't nothing for you to do but freeze. And you be like, man, so just let us work, man. And you be like, man, ain't nothing for you to do. So you just standing out there freezing in 30-something degrees temperature. The ground is frozen. You can't do nothing. Your hands so cold, feel like they finna drop. Your toes feel like they finna break off at any given moment. And you just out there standing up because it ain't nothing to do. But when it's hot, you working so hard that you hoping that he slow it down. And then sometimes the field farmers will be making bets. be making bets. I bet you I make my line, I work your line today. So when they doing that, you ain't finna get a break. As soon as you get out of cut, swing around. Swing it around me and go to another cut. So you swing it around, you swing it, and they'll swing it. You'll be like, Sarge, man, stop using us up. Then he'll call. You say something else to me, I'm gonna hit that button on you. You know what they gonna come do to you. So you kind of like checkmate it because you don't want the people to beat you up because they breaking something on you. They ain't just beating you up and you all right. You know, they beating you up and you got a limb broke. You got cuts in your face and your head. So people trying to avoid that, and then you just trying to go through it. It's extremely hard.
Thank you so much for that, Terrence. Tony, I'm just wondering, we mentioned many states are only paying incarcerated workers pennies an hour or nothing at all. And I'm just wondering, as someone who's worked within the system, what do you see as the challenges in changing the labor and work practices of the facilities around the country? And does the overall system need to be changed so that incarcerated workers are treated fairly and humanely and paid a decent wage? And maybe what do you see as Maine doing better? Can you give us some examples of that?
Sure. I think that one of the aspects that Maine is trying to improve upon is recognizing the work that residents, excuse my term, we use the terminology residents, not prisoners or inmates. So residents and how they do contribute back into our facilities and thus their living community. So recognizing that, how do we sustain the work that they put in to a true translation into skills that they can use upon reentry. So I'm going back to that education piece and going back to partnerships with the Department of Labor apprenticeship programs, so that the experiences that they can put in also translate to true experiences in the workforce and the community. So I think that's one aspect that takes a lot of investment financially, internally, on how that looks like. So one change will obviously require how you look at prioritize funding to help support that. Other ways, as we know within state governments, that funding is set and limited, is exploring opportunities through grants and other partners to see what else is out there to help support opportunities and expand upon what could be resources for the residents. We look at, we recognize that Maine is also different just in our population size. In the State Department of Corrections, there's only 1,800 residents that are currently incarcerated. And our work release facilities are unfenced. So they're very different than from what we know from some of our counterparts across the country. And those opportunities lead to work release opportunities for a whole set of diverse employers in which pay is at a competitive rate, just like any other individual applying for that. What we have seen, though, as we provide more education on the front end or upstream while they are starting their incarceration, especially if we look at areas like the construction field, if we can provide accredited training, which allows them to be more competitive, they're seeing that benefit while they're still incarcerated, finishing their sentences by being able to show the international accreditation in that field to be a competitive employee with that agency. We also take a look at individual approaches on work skills that may be more applicable for that particular resident, but also we're looking at trends within the state as it relates to Department of Labor statistics. So we recently ventured, how do we get residents through CDL courses so that they could, again, get some real work experience at real good wages in a competitive field, because we know that our nation relies on trucking for short haul, long haul, and you name it, you name the goods. So it's using data to inform us on what kind of things that we need to be thinking for in the future, and not just those short-term, needs or things that we may think that we want. We're also exploring and listening to residents on what they want as well.
Thank you. Given the time, we've almost run out of time. This has been a very lively discussion, but I'm just wondering if maybe each one of you can kind of go through and give us kind of 1 to 2 minutes of your final thoughts and ideas on this issue of prison labor and these two very different systems, one that is in place and for rights and protections for workers on the outside, and those who are incarcerated who have a very, very different system. Professor Armstrong, maybe you can go first.
Sure, and thank you so much. Again, this has been a really great conversation. I've been taking notes, learning so much from my panelists. So I think first, we need to focus on the fact that these are, in fact, our institutions. These are our agencies. They belong to us, right? We pay for them. And we want to make sure that what we're paying for is an investment in our own safety, right? And in the healing work to decrease crime in the future. And so we want to think about how these places operate. So think about transparency and ask questions, right? So when you are being confronted with a new opportunity in terms of funding the sheriff or prison construction or the Department of Corrections, you can ask your representatives, well, what is the revenue then from prison labor? What does that look like? And how is that being applied, right? Because I am paying $55,000 a year for you to house this person, right? So one is I want you to just think about transparency and asking all of the questions. The second thing I want you to think about, though, is just because the Constitution says we can, doesn't mean that we should. And there's a fundamental difference there, right? We can force someone to work, but that doesn't mean that we should do it in a way that puts their own health, safety, and dignity at risk. And so I really want us to think creatively about what is the world that we want to live in, and then take steps to actually build that world. Thank you.
Thank you. Secretary Treasurer Redmond, do you want to go next?
Sure. Now, this has been an exciting discussion. I really appreciate being with all of the panelists. Look, for the labor movement, this lawsuit is a strong first step toward eliminating forced labor in Alabama prison system and righting the wrongs from this egregious labor exploitation. This is our main priority in this area, but we're going to be looking at other states also as we go forward. But as the suit moves through the courts, then I would appeal to worker advocates, union members, anybody who care at all about human rights and racial and economic justice. They can do a few things to support this work. As people in the labor movement know, we often go toe-to-toe with well-heeled politicians and corporations. And even though they spend millions in union busting campaigns to delay first contracts and a bargain in bad faith, we win with worker solidarity, with people joining together. And we use our solidarity to hold politicians and corporations accountable. And that's what we can do here by using our worker solidarity, our union solidarity to advocate for those incarcerated. So the first way that I would encourage people to get involved is to vote. I mean, we need to hold politicians accountable. And while Governor Ivey and the Attorney General are not on the ballot this year, there are important elections for statewide office in Alabama, and of course for the U.S. House of Representatives and for President of the United States. And, I've learned through my many years in this movement is that when working people elect leaders who share our values, then we're able to influence and advocate for policies that benefit workers and benefit our communities. And at that point, we're able to hold corporations accountable. So, I would call on all my laborers, brothers and sisters and siblings, and anybody on this call who consider themselves a proponent for justice and fairness, okay, to really get involved in this movement. if it's nothing but writing a letter to your governor, if you live in the South where you have prison labor, to your representatives and let them know that work has value, and the people, everybody who perform work has value, and these folks need a voice, and we can be that voice.
Thank you. Deputy Commissioner Cantillo.
I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon, and I wanted to thank the Aspen Institute for the invitation.
And I saved the last spot for Terrence.
I would also like to say thank y'all for this opportunity, and thank you for putting this panel together. I think the big thing that I would like to say is we need to remember that just because the crime was committed by someone, that person doesn't lose their human dignity, nor do they become separate from the human race. And we got to stop allowing our politicians to get voted in by people. And once they get voted in, to take on a whole different ideology than those that they promised during their campaign, so that they can stop treating other human beings as less than human beings because they have committed a crime.
Thank you so much. I guess I'm being asked to ask one more question, and so I'm gonna tap you, Professor Armstrong, one more time, because I know you are an expert on this and you've spoken about it a lot with us to help us understand it. Can you maybe walk us a little bit through this 13th Amendment and the movement to remove the exclusionary clause, both from the US Constitution and also language from the state constitutions? What are the implications of this? Why is this being pushed, and why is it important?
So first, we see this happening in states across the US that they are particularly putting to a ballot, so for a general population vote, the opportunity to amend their state constitutions to eliminate this exception that we started the conversation off with, this exception that allows for involuntary servitude if you've been convicted of a crime. And it's an important conversation. This is an amendment that in many ways is being driven, these correction processes are being driven by incarcerated people who were saying, why does the law get to make me a slave again? And so if we're committed to this work, it means that we are also committed to understanding and listening to the perspectives of people who are in this situation. That being said, it's also important for us to realize that simply amending our constitutions doesn't change some of the harms that we've talked about today. Those harms are not necessarily tied to the fact that somebody can be forced to work. We, in fact, could choose to protect incarcerated workers to the same extent as we do free world workers. We could, if we wanted to, ensure that our departments of corrections align, as Maine does, with their Department of Labor to ensure that the work that people are doing is work that's connected to their reentry and to workforce development. So it's an important conversation. It's one that's driven by concerns of people who are incarcerated. At the same time, we need to realize that that's not the only way that we can address these very real harms. And in fact, there are things that we can do today, whether or not those amendments pass, to make things fair, humane, and dignified for everyone.
Thank you. And thanks to everybody. This has been, again, a very lively and educational panel, and I've learned a few things today. I thought after 2 years of immersing myself in this that I knew a lot, but I've learned a lot today as well. So thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you.
I want to say thank you to Secretary Treasurer Redmond, Andrea, Terrence, Tony, and Margie for such a wonderful discussion, very eye-opening. I know we just barely scratched the surface on this, but hopefully we've piqued a lot of your curiosity to learn more, to get involved in your local community, to reach out to some of these great speakers we've had today, to tap their expertise for ideas on, how we can address this. Again, just thank you to Margie as well for moderating this discussion and for all her work to cover this important issue too. So stay tuned for our next event on October 23rd at 2 o'clock Eastern. That one is going to be on community benefits agreements, another tool for creating good jobs. And we're going to host that with our colleagues at Jobs to Move America. Jobs to Move America is another organization that's involved in the issue that we discussed today, and another resource for you all that are looking to learn more about it. I want to thank our great team at the Economic Opportunities Program for pulling together today's event. There were so many people involved over the last several months and kind of learning about this and helping shape it. But special thanks to my colleague Finney, my colleagues Maxwell and Francis, Tony, Nora, Merritt. Thanks to our colleagues at Architects for putting together today's show. And thanks to Maureen Conway for all her support, leadership, and guidance on this event and this series. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for being engaged. Thanks for being curious. Hope to see you again. We'll see you next time.